Nuss. 5 years ago, I spent Christmas Eve alone at a diner off Route 9, cutting into a piece of dry turkey and trying not to cry into my cranberry sauce. I had no idea that the couple in the booth across from me would end up standing next to me at my wedding, being introduced to 200 guests as the parents of the bride. My biological parents were there too. They found out that night, standing near the back, uninvited, watching, exactly what they had thrown away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to go back to the November when I was 26, sitting in my car outside my apartment for 40 minutes because I couldn't stop shaking long enough to go inside. My mother had just called me. I remember every word. I'd gotten better at that over the years, memorizing the exact sentences people used to hurt me, the way you memorize the lyrics to a song you never wanted to know. She said, "Honey, I think it would be better if you didn't come home this Christmas. Your brother is bringing Vanessa, and you know how things get between you two. We just want it to be peaceful this year." I said, "What things? What things get between us?" She said, "You know what I mean." I didn't say anything after that. I just held the phone and listened to her breathe, waiting for me to make it easy for her. That's what I'd always done. Made things easy for everyone else, so that everyone else didn't have to feel uncomfortable. "It's just one Christmas," she said. "You understand, right?" I said yes. I always said yes. Then I sat in my car for 40 minutes and tried to remember the last time my mother had called me just to talk. Not to ask me to do something, not to manage a situation, just to hear my voice. I couldn't think of one. You have to understand something about my family before any of this makes sense. I am the oldest of three. My brother, who is 4 years younger than me, has been my mother's priority since the day he was born. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I've done enough therapy to say it the way you'd say a weather report. Factual. Observable. He was her favorite. My younger sister landed somewhere in the middle. I was the one who was expected to be fine. My father was quieter about it, but quieter isn't the same as better. He watched. He said nothing. That's its own kind of message. I moved 3 states away at 22 for a job in environmental consulting. My mother told people it was so far, even though it was a 4-hour drive. I think the distance suited everyone, including me. I came home for holidays because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. Because I thought one day something would shift and I'd walk through the door and feel like I belonged there. It never shifted. And then, one Christmas, they stopped even pretending they wanted me there. I booked a table for one at a diner called Patton's on December 24th because I couldn't stand the thought of eating reheated soup alone in my apartment while my phone showed me my family's photos on social media. I figured a diner would be neutral. Bright lights, strangers, pie. I arrived at 7 and got seated near the window. The place was half full, other people with nowhere specific to be, or people grabbing food before heading somewhere. A waitress with a Santa hat and tired eyes handed me a laminated menu. The booth directly across from mine had a couple in it, older, maybe late 50s. The man had reading glasses pushed up on his head and was arguing gently with the woman about whether the mashed potatoes came with gravy automatically or if you had to ask. She was laughing at him. I watched them for a second longer than I should have. There was something about the way they were with each other. Easy, fond, like people who had been laughing at the same things for 30 years and still meant it. I looked back at my menu. Somewhere between ordering and waiting for my food, I started crying. Not dramatically, I wasn't sobbing. It was the kind of crying that happens before you realize it's happening, when your eyes just fill up and you're blinking too fast and your throat gets tight. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth and stared at the table and told myself to stop. "Honey." I looked up. The woman from the booth across from me was standing at the edge of my table. She had warm brown eyes and a burgundy sweater and the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime noticing things other people missed. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said. Are you okay? And I don't know why. I don't know why this particular stranger, at this particular moment, but something in the way she asked it undid me. Not the words. The way she said them. like she actually wanted to know. Not really, I said. But I will be. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, she said. Her husband appeared at her shoulder. He had the slightly helpless look of a man who followed his wife into situations because he trusted her judgment completely. We have way too much food, she said, gesturing back toward their booth. And we'd genuinely love the company if you want. I should have said no. I was a stranger. They were strangers. It was a weird thing to do. I picked up my water glass and followed her. Their names were Barbara and Jean. They lived 20 minutes from the diner. They had one son who was spending Christmas with his girlfriend's family in Portland, and they had come to Patton's every Christmas Eve for 11 years because it was where they'd had their first date, back when it was a different restaurant with a different name, and much worse coffee. Barbara asked me questions the way people do when they're genuinely curious. Not rapid fire, not performative, but careful. She'd ask something and then actually listen to the answer, and then ask a follow-up that showed she'd been paying attention. I told them more than I meant to. I told them about my family, about the phone call, about the drive down Route 9 trying to decide whether to just keep going south and spend Christmas somewhere no one knew me. I told them I was 26 and I had a good job and a nice apartment, and I couldn't figure out why I still wanted my mother to be proud of me. Jean said, "That doesn't go away, you know, wanting that. Even when it should." Barbara looked at him sideways. "I'm just being honest," he said. "He's right," she said to me. "It doesn't go away, but it gets quieter. When you fill in the space with other things." We stayed at Patton's until they dimmed the lights at 10. Barbara hugged me in the parking lot. Jean handed me a card with their home phone number on it. An actual card, the kind people don't have anymore, and said I was welcome to call if I ever needed anything. I thought, that's the nicest thing a stranger has ever said to me. I drove home and cried again, but differently. I called Barbara in February. I don't even remember what made me do it. I was having a rough week. A project at work had gone sideways and I'd had a fight with a friend, and I just wanted to hear a voice that felt safe. I sat with the card for an hour before I dialed. She answered on the second ring and sounded genuinely happy to hear from me. She asked about my job. She told me about a book she was reading. She invited me to dinner the following Saturday. I went. And then I went again. Over the next year, it became a regular thing. Dinner at their house every few weeks. Phone calls in between. Barbara texted me articles she thought I'd like. Jean sent me a photograph he'd taken on a hike that reminded him of something I'd said about a park near my apartment. Small things. Consistent things. My own mother texted me maybe once a month, usually to tell me something my brother had accomplished. I'm not saying that to be bitter. I'm saying it because it mattered. Because I was 26 years old and I was learning for the first time what it felt like to be in someone's peripheral vision in a good way. To be thought of when you weren't in the room. Their son came home for Thanksgiving that year. His name was Owen. He was 30, a structural engineer, and he had the same easy warmth his mother had, filtered through his father's quieter delivery. He showed up to dinner with a bottle of wine and immediately started arguing with Jean about something architectural. And Barbara caught my eye across the table and smiled like she was showing me something she loved. Owen and I talked for 3 hours after dinner, while Barbara and Jean pretended to watch television in the other room. We talked about work and cities and what we'd each gotten wrong in our 20s. He was easy to talk to in the way that good listeners always are. He made you feel like what you were saying mattered enough to respond to thoughtfully. I drove home that night thinking, I didn't know families could feel like that. I genuinely did not know. Owen and I started dating 4 months later. I want to be clear that it wasn't strange or calculated. It wasn't even surprising really to anyone who knew us. Barbara said later that she'd wondered, watching us that first Thanksgiving. Jean said he'd known by dessert. It just happened the way things happen when two people spend enough time in proximity to each other and keep finding reasons to stay. The only complicated part was my own family. Not because they objected, they barely registered it. I mentioned Owen to my mother on the phone once and she said, "Oh, that's nice." and pivoted immediately to telling me about my brother's promotion. I don't think she processed who Owen was or where he'd come from. I don't think she tried. My father sent me a generic congratulations text when I mentioned I was seeing someone seriously. 3 sentences. I stopped expecting more. That was its own kind of progress. Owen proposed 2 years later at a state park I'd told him about on our first real conversation. He'd remembered. That's what I thought when I saw the ring. Not "oh my god," or "I can't believe this," but he remembered. We planned a small wedding. 90 people. A venue outside the city, September, late afternoon light. When I sat down to write the guest list, I stared at my parents' names for a long time. I thought about Christmas Eve at Patton's Diner. I thought about the phone call. I thought about all the Christmas Eves before that one. Sitting at the kids' table long past the age when that made sense. Listening to my brother's stories get told back to me as family history while mine went unmentioned. I thought about calling my mother to tell her I'd gotten a promotion, and she'd asked me how my brother was doing before I'd finished my sentence. I put my parents on the list. And my sister. Not my brother. That's a longer story, and it's his to carry now. I didn't call my mother to invite her personally. I sent a card, like you do. Formal, correct. The same card I sent to the other guests. She called me immediately. "We're coming. Of course we're coming," she said, as if I'd asked a question. "I'll need to know the dress code and the timeline. And your father wants to know if he's walking you down the aisle." I paused. "No," I said. "I'm walking with Barbara and Jean." Silence. "Who?" "Jean and Barbara. They'll be introduced as the parents of the bride." More silence. Long enough that I could hear the TV on in the background. I recognized the sound. I'd heard it my whole childhood. The television that was always on. The background noise of a house where no one was really present with each other. "I don't understand," my mother said finally. "I know," I said. "But that's what's happening. I wanted to let you know ahead of time." She said several things after that, about how it would look, about what people would think, about how she was my mother, my real mother. And didn't that count for something? I waited until she was done. "It counts," I said. "It just doesn't change anything." The week before the wedding, my mother called 4 more times. My father called once, which was more than he called me in the previous year combined. My sister sent me a long message that started sympathetically and ended with, "I just think you should consider how this looks for the family." I read it once and put my phone in a drawer. Owen found me sitting on the kitchen floor that night, back against the cabinet, just breathing. He sat down next to me without saying anything. After a minute I said, "I keep waiting to feel worse about it." He said, "Maybe you've just already done the grieving." I thought about that. About all the years I'd spent grieving something that was still technically alive. The relationship that never existed. The mother who never quite showed up. The family that never felt like one. Maybe you can grieve something before it's over. Maybe that's what I'd been doing every Christmas Eve for years. "Barbara called today," I said. "I know," he said. "She told me she was bringing that lemon cake you like." I laughed. It surprised me. The day of the wedding was warm for September, the kind of afternoon where the light does something golden about an hour before sunset, and everything looks like it's been thought about. Barbara spent the morning with me while I got ready. She didn't hover or give advice I didn't ask for. She just sat in the chair in the corner of the room, drinking coffee, talking about small things, a bird she'd seen in the backyard, a podcast Jean had tried to explain to her, a memory she had of the first time she'd met me at Patton's and thought to herself, "That girl needs someone in her corner." "I almost didn't come over," she said. "Jean had to talk me into it. I didn't want to intrude." "I'm glad you intruded," I said. She reached over and squeezed my hand once. She didn't make a production of it. My parents arrived and were seated with the other guests. I saw them from across the room when I was still in the corridor. My mother in a blue dress I didn't recognize, my father in a suit. Both of them scanning the space with the slightly stiff posture of people in unfamiliar territory. They looked smaller than I remembered. Not in a cruel way, just real-sized, finally. The ceremony was simple. We wrote our own vows, which I'd been terrified about and which ended up being the truest things I'd said out loud in years. When we were introduced and the officiant asked who was presenting the bride, Jean stood up on one side of me and Barbara on the other. Jean had teared up getting dressed that morning, according to Owen, who had texted me about it at 7 a.m. with a heart emoji. Barbara kept her composure, but her chin was doing that thing it does. The officiant said, presented by her chosen family, Jean and Barbara. I heard a sound from somewhere in the room that I recognized. My mother. Not crying. More like a breath, let out that had been held too long. I didn't look. At the reception, things were quiet on my family's end. Polite. Careful. My mother came up to me before dinner and hugged me and said I looked beautiful. She said it the way people say things when they're trying very hard. I thanked her. I meant it, in my way. My father shook Owen's hand. He told him to take care of me. It was the most direct thing he'd said to me in years, and it wasn't even said to me. Jean gave a toast. He told the story of Christmas Eve at Patton's from his perspective. The part where Barbara had said quietly, "That young woman is spending Christmas alone, and I don't think we should let that happen." And how he'd said, "Barbara, we don't know her." And how Barbara had picked up her water glass and walked across the restaurant anyway, because she never needed more information than someone needs company. People laughed. People cried a little. Owen held my hand under the table. I looked across the room at my parents. My mother Senwis watching Jean give the toast. I don't know what she was thinking. I'm not sure she knew either. I thought about the girl who had sat in her car for 40 minutes outside her apartment and couldn't stop shaking. The girl who had said yes to her mother on the phone and then sat in silence with the weight of it. The girl who had shown up alone to a diner on Christmas Eve because she had nowhere else to go and ended up exactly where she needed to be. I thought, I don't hate my parents. That's important to say. I don't hate them, and I'm not performing forgiveness for an audience. I just finally understand that some people are not capable of giving you what you need, and staying close to them while waiting for that to change costs you years that you don't get back. I chose something different. I chose people who chose me. At the end of the night, my parents came to say goodbye. My mother hugged me again and held on a second longer. She said, "I hope you're happy." I said, "I am." She nodded once, like she was filing something away. My father put his hand briefly on my shoulder. He said my name. Just my name, nothing after it, like he had more to say and couldn't find the shape of it. I covered his hand with mine for 1 second. Then I stepped back. I watched them walk to the parking lot together, my mother's heels clicking on the stone path, my father's hand at the small of her back. They looked like two people who understood each other completely and had, in that shared understanding, missed something they couldn't name. I hope they figure it out someday. I mean that, but I didn't wait anymore. Barbara found me 5 minutes later, shoes off, carrying them in one hand, cheeks pink from dancing with Jean. She looped her arm through mine and said, "Ready to go eat leftover cake in the hotel room with us?" Owen appeared at my other side. He handed me a glass of water. I looked at the two of them. 3 of them. Jean, coming up behind Barbara with his jacket over his arm and his reading glasses slightly askew, and felt something I used to not have a name for. I have a name for it now. It's home. Not the place kind. The people kind. The kind you don't inherit. The kind you find when you stop letting the people who were supposed to love you talk you out of knowing what love actually looks like. I found mine in a diner on Route 9 on Christmas Eve, when a woman I'd never met picked up her water glass and walked across the room because she couldn't stand the thought of someone spending the holidays alone. If you're waiting for your family to become what you need them to be, I see you. I spent years there. But I want you to know, the table you actually belong at might be somewhere you haven't sat down yet. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that Christmas Eve at Patton's Diner, not in any grand philosophical way. Just the quiet, ordinary way you start to trace things backward when your life turns out differently than you expected, and you're trying to understand the chain of decisions that led you somewhere good. My parents made a choice. A small one, in their minds probably. One Christmas. One phone call. We just want it to be peaceful. They didn't think of it as a door closing. They thought of it as a minor adjustment, a rearrangement of the holiday schedule. What they didn't understand. What I don't think they're capable of understanding is that every small choice is a brick. You lay enough of them in the same direction and eventually you've built a wall, and you don't get to be surprised when someone stops trying to climb it. I made choices too. I drove to that diner instead of staying home. I said, "Not really," when Barbara asked if I was okay, instead of saying, "I'm fine," the way I'd been trained to say my whole life. I picked up my water glass and followed a stranger across a restaurant because something in me was tired, genuinely tired, of sitting alone and calling it normal. That was its own kind of brick, just laid in a different direction. What I know now, 4 years on, is that the people who are supposed to show up for you and don't, they teach you something too. Not what they intended to teach you, but something real. They teach you the difference between obligation and love. Between presence and habit. Between someone who stays because they have to and someone who stays because they want to. I learned that difference from Barbara and Jean, but I only recognized it because my parents had shown me the opposite for so long. That's not a comfortable thing to say. It sounds like I'm crediting my parents for something good, and I don't mean it that way. What I mean is that pain, when you survive it without letting it hollow you out, can make you precise. It made me precise. I stopped accepting vague warmth as a substitute for the real thing. I stopped mistaking someone's physical presence for their attention. I learned to notice, really notice, when someone was genuinely interested in me versus when they were simply tolerating me. Barbara taught me what the real thing looked like. My parents taught me how to tell the difference. The courage part is harder to explain. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment. It was 100 small decisions not to shrink. Not to say I'm fine when I wasn't. Not to remove myself from spaces to make other people comfortable. Not to send a personal phone call to invite people who had spent years treating my absence as a convenience. I chose what the moment at my wedding meant. I chose who stood next to me. That took something. Not bravado, but the quiet, stubborn kind of courage that comes from finally deciding your own life is worth showing up for. What I want, if you're in the part of the story I used to be in. The part where you're still waiting, still hoping, still making yourself smaller. So the people who should love you aren't inconvenienced by you. Is for you to understand that you are not the problem that needs to be managed. You are a person who deserves to be in someone's peripheral vision every day. Not just when it's convenient. Not just when the holidays are over. Every ordinary Tuesday. The table you belong at exists. You may not have found it yet, but I promise you it's there, somewhere, maybe in a diner you haven't walked into yet, with a woman who will pick up her water glass and cross the room because she can't stand the thought of you sitting alone. That's not luck. That's what happens when you stop leaving before anyone gets the chance to choose you.